back to the garage. Started my morning off at the swap meet. Got there early in the morning. That was a beautiful morning, by the way. I didn't buy anything. Walked around, saw some nice cars. You saw some of that footage. But now what we're gonna do, I got a big announcement coming up. But in order to make that announcement, I gotta do some work. So today, I gotta do some work on the El Camino. And the reason I'm doing work on the El Camino, and there's nothing big. I just gotta do some maintenance, some stuff that I've been needing to do, that I'm finally gonna get around to doing, because I'm gonna do Hot Rod Power Tour in that El Camino. So I've done a lot of work on this El Camino. When I first got it, it didn't run very well, but since I didn't know how G-bodies run, and what I mean by G-body is those mid-80s El Camino, Monte Carlo, Buick Regal, Pontiac, they all pretty much look the same. I think they got the same wheelbase. I didn't know how those ran. So when I first got it, I drove it. I mean, it ran, but it did have like a little bit of lack of power, but I just figured, oh, that's from the 80s. Everything was smog, restricted, smog restricted. So they took a lot of power out of it to get them to pass emissions. And I found out that this thing was really, really, really badly set up. The carburetor was all the way misadjusted, which was causing a lot of the problems that I have with that vehicle. It got very, very just garbage gas mileage. I've worked on a lot of carburetors in my day. I was actually, I don't want to say young enough, but when I started at the dealer, we were still working on carburetors. We were still doing rebuilds. We were still tuning them up, smogging them on carburetors. So I had a lot of experience on carburetors. The one thing I didn't have too much experience on, because by the time I got there, fuel injection was a thing. But the mid-80s vehicles had a carburetor with an electronic solenoid called GM calls it a mixture control solenoid. Ford called them variable Venturis. From what I remember, those were garbage. Well, this carburetor is a Quadrajet carburetor with a mixture control solenoid in it. And all the adjustments were off, like completely off, right? Just, make a long story short, the car runs beautiful now. It accelerates great. And I think I got the gas mileage fixed from what I did yesterday. The hardest part was finding the right information for this vehicle. Well, for the carburetor. Because there is a lot out there, and a lot of it, well, I can't say it's wrong. I read some of it wrong. I'll show you some of the forums and some of the information that I was reading and why it was wrong. Well, no, it wasn't wrong. I was reading it wrong. But I finally got the car adjusted correctly. Well, I finally got the carburetor adjusted correctly. It runs absolutely amazing. And like I said, I think I fixed the gas mileage. So let me show you this car. This right here is a Rochester. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think it's made by Rochester. So it's a Quadrajet carburetor. The main difference between this carburetor and a regular carburetor is this solenoid right here. This solenoid is a mixture control solenoid. It's electronically controlled and then adjusts the fuel mixture based on oxygen sensor. So most of the time when you're doing regular driving and a little bit of acceleration, not too heavy acceleration, that's when your secondaries kick in. But you're running on these two, and these are tiny to feed that big 350 engine. But that's where your fuel economy comes in. They say these carburetors are great for fuel economy and for drivability when they're adjusted correctly. Well, since I was misadjusting it the whole time, that's why I was running like garbage. Let's get all these screws out of here. These are your metering rods. So your metering rods are controlled by vacuum on a regular Quadrajet. Right under here, there's an electronic solenoid that makes this is your accelerator pump, that makes this do this. So when you hear these engines running, you will hear this. It's not very loud, but as long as it's doing that, that means that this is doing its job. Now, to what extent of it this is doing its job all depends on all the other inputs. So the main adjustment I was doing incorrectly is the float level. So your fuel comes in through here, goes through that needle and seat, and then it fills up this bowl right here. This is your carburetor bowl. That's the fuel the carburetor is going to use to run your engine. So when fuel comes in through the pintle, it'll fill up this bowl, make the float, and then once it reaches this point, it's going to shut off the fuel. Because if you have too much fuel in this bowl, you're going to make the vehicle run rich. I think right now it's set up to where it should be, which is like a ½ an inch. So when your carburetor float is too low, you fill this up with too much fuel, and then the fuel basically, I mean, this is a bad example, but it'll like just spill in to where it shouldn't. So the next one that I finally figured out, finally got the right information, is this adjustment right here. Your mixture control solenoid adjustment. So if this is off, it'll throw everything else off. Now there's a spec that I finally found, because there's an actual tool that they don't make that goes where this metering rod goes. It's just like a spacer. It goes between that pintle and the top of where that metering rod goes. And you got to set this up to a certain height. I couldn't find the actual spec until just recently. I found it. I don't have the tool, but I was able to get the actual measurement for the tool that it takes. I just took the measurement, held this down to where the measurement would be, and then adjusted this accordingly. And that seemed to take care of a lot of my problems that I was having with this carburetor. And like I said, they're not problems with the carburetor, they're problems with the guy adjusting the carburetor, which is me. Well, one of the main things that I was doing incorrectly is that when you set these carburetors up, so on a regular carburetor, you take the air cleaner off, you get to all your adjustments, right? You get to play around, you know, adjust your throttle opening, adjust your idle mixture screws, which are under there, and then you put everything back on. Well, with this carburetor, you cannot do that. This carburetor actually, you have to make all the adjustments on this carburetor with the air horn on. I'm sorry, with the air cleaner on. When you make adjustments, even with just this part of the air cleaner off, it will change some of the idle settings and all that. So when you make adjustments on this carb, you make an adjustment, put this back on, let the engine settle, and then reevaluate. There's an actual tool to measure this adjustment right here that I don't have. I found another video on YouTube that says that you can put these out like four turns out. So what you do is you bottom it out all the way down, and you go out 4 turns. And after you get all that set up, you get a dwell meter, and what you do is this lead right here is your dwell setting for that mixture control solenoid that I showed you earlier. So you plug into that to battery ground, and then what you do is you adjust your idle mixture screws with this on. You can't do it with it off. If you do it with it off, it'll make it run all kinds of funky. So the GoPro decided not to record this next part. You plug your dwell meter into this lead and to the battery positive, and then you go ahead and adjust your idle mixture screws and your air bleed screw until you get a reading of 35 on the 6-cylinder scale on your dwell meter. And also, you want to try and get the smoothest idle you can while you're doing this. And it's only like quarter turns, eighth turns. You don't really need to turn those screws that much. But your idle mixture screws, you do need to turn them the same amount of turns. So if you go out a quarter turn or you go in a quarter turn, you got to do them both at the same time in order to get the smoothest idle and your dwell meter reading at 35. See, so after I made all of those adjustments, now it runs amazing. It accelerates almost perfect. Still has a little bit of a lag. There's still a little bit of tweaking I got to do to it. Almost all of the problems that I was having are gone. There's a few things that I got to do to this, because when you do the hot rod power tour and you got to drive, well, I got to drive to Irwindale, I got to drive to Vegas, and I got to drive back to Pomona in this vehicle to get my little placard or sticker. I don't know what they give away. I definitely need to put a radio in it, because I've been using a Bluetooth speaker for the longest time. I finally got a radio at the swap meet for very cheap. So I got to do the rear shocks on this one. There are air shocks because I plan to take some stuff with me in case I have to sleep. In case I have to sleep inside, you know, because I don't know, I've looked and there's no hotels available, but I guess we'll deal with that when we get there. And then I'm gonna drive to a friend's house because I gotta look at a car of his that I wanna show you guys. I haven't seen it in probably about a year, but it's something that we gotta start ordering parts for. So I'm gonna go ahead and drive up there and show it to you guys to see potentially another. from a year ago, doesn't look like much has changed. I guess the dude that was working on it finally bailed, like completely. So they're looking to me, well, they're asking me for help to get this back together. But there is a lot to do. I think that's what I said on the last video. It's like, my goodness gracious, there is a lot to do on this car. But like anything else, it's it's one step at a time. Can't make an omelet without scrambling a few eggs or something like that. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of work to be done on this car. From what I can see, and from what they tell me, it looks like we're missing a bunch of brackets for the front accessory drive. That's usually where your AC compressor would go. Power steering usually goes right here. See the bracket, but alternator is here. Oh, it's got the alternator bracket. So there's stuff there. I don't know why. This is a crank pulley. I don't know why it's off. One thing I did notice though, if you look at the back where the intake is, you see that gasket sticking out? That should not be like that. So obviously I gotta redo that. It doesn't have any lines. See, trans cooler lines are not in it. Brake lines are not in it. It doesn't even have a dip. I mean, well, definitely doesn't have a dipstick, but it doesn't have a. You can see it on there. There's no drain plug for the oil pan. I think that's what that hole was for. So, whew. These are what they call a money pit. But hey, man, they're willing to spend the money. I guess we're willing to do something to it, right? At least get started on it. But it definitely needs a lot of work. Thanks again for joining me. Again, appreciate you. Appreciate all you watching. If you're liking the content, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever you want. As you can see, there's a lot to do. A lot to do on this car. But we gotta get started, right? Thanks again for watching. I'll catch you on the next one.